Hello, everyone. I'm your People Behind the Science podcast host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am so excited to welcome you to our show today, episode 631. Today, we are going to be chatting with our guest, Dr. Stephanie Weir. And listeners, I'm glad to have you all joining me for our interview today. But if you want to continue meeting fantastic scientists through our show, you can follow us on Twitter at PBT Science, and I'm at PhD Marie. Today in our interview, Stephanie is going to share some of her own experiences in her life, her career, and her research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our exceptional people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Stephanie Weir. So, Stephanie, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Marie. It's great to be here.
Well, we are so excited to welcome you to the program and to learn from you today. So let me start by first telling our listeners a little bit more about you. So listeners, Stephanie is a senior scientist and strategy advisor at the Nature Conservancy, as well as a visiting fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and also a visiting scientist at Duke University Marine Lab. Stephanie received her bachelor's degree in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia and her master's and PhD degrees in marine sciences from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She began working there at the Nature Conservancy in 2001. And Stephanie and her work have been featured in numerous media outlets. She's also been named one of Women's Health Magazine's Clean and Green Pioneers and Babbel.com's Moms Who Are Changing the World. In addition, Stephanie was selected as a member of the inaugural class of NatureNet Science Fellows, a program sponsored by the Nature Conservancy and 6 leading universities that brings new approaches to solving global challenges surrounding sustainable provision of food, energy, and water. And Stephanie, today we're excited to learn more about you, of course, as a scientist, but also more generally as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I am a mother of 2 almost teenagers. One's a teenager and the other is just about there. So that kind of takes up the majority of my time. So the sorts of things we like to do together are spend time in nature. We're very cliche in that way. My husband is a professor of marine biology at Duke University. So between our little crew, we're just a bunch of nature nerds, to be honest.
Fantastic. So what do you like to do when you're out in nature?
Until very recently, we were living at the coast in coastal North Carolina. So we'd spend a lot of time kayaking and just getting into the water. Now we do a lot of hiking and particularly spending a lot of time hunting for salamanders. So I've got kids that love to find salamanders. So it's, again, nerding out on nature. Lots of hiking.
I love it. Well, it sounds like your passions outside of science then collide with what you do in science. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you describe your scientific work to people who might not be familiar?
My work is really applied. I started my career looking at much more, I would say maybe a bit more esoteric questions, trying to understand how communities were organized in marine systems and what controlled the productivity of those systems and the predator-prey relationships and the herbivore relationships and who was eating what kind of thing. But very quickly in my work, I started looking at, well, what does that mean to us? And instead of taking an academic route, I decided to go into conservation. So I started taking what I knew about the natural world and around marine systems, and particularly coastal and coral reef systems, and thinking about what we can do to better protect them and how can people continue to benefit from them into the future. This is a big question because we depend so much on these coastal marine systems. And the story of my work is very serendipitous. It sort of went from one thing to the next, always choosing something that looked fun and interesting. And so really early in my career, after graduate school, I found myself in the Caribbean working on marine protected areas, trying to figure out how to protect the natural resources in a small island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it's pretty much always been around coral reefs. And my work has often just gone from threat to threat to threat. So very early on, we were looking at overfishing and how we manage that. And then it evolved into looking at the impacts of climate change. And now I am all about something that most people probably think is crazy to be all about, but I'm all about sewage pollution and looking at the impacts of that on both human health and environmental health.
I can say with certainty, I haven't met very many people who are excited about talking about sewage pollution. So
no, but it is super fun to talk about.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting into the details of your work, Stephanie, as we go through our conversation today. And as you alluded to, there are some big challenges that you are tackling in the area of conservation. And I know it can be daunting sometimes. So having a bit of motivation and inspiration to keep you going can be helpful. So for our listeners out there who might be looking for a bit of inspiration or motivation today, do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something that really keeps you going?
Actually, I do. And this is something that I remind myself of on a regular basis. And I apologize in advance if you hear my rooster crowing in the background. He is very noisy. And I have to note, at least because I am a marine biologist, we named him Jacques Cousteau.
Oh my goodness. I love it.
That's our fun fact of the day. Okay. So the quote actually comes from a beautiful Mary Oliver poem, The Summer Day. And it's the very last two lines of the poem. And it is, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" That quote is a reminder to me all the time of the choices I'm making and making sure that I am doing something that is worthy of my one wild and precious life. And so I think about that both with my work and with how I spend time with my family.
That is a fantastic quote. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today, Stephanie. And you mentioned, of course, your rooster named after Jacques Cousteau, which I absolutely love. I think having inspirational figures or motivational figures in science can be really great for kind of getting people started on the career path, but also helping you get to where you are today, getting through some of those tough times. So for you, when you look back on your career, are there particular scientists or mentors or role models who really stand out for you?
I mean, I think as a child, I actually was, it's funny, I had forgotten this, and it's always fun to sort of look at your history to help you explain to yourself where you are now. I discovered that I had joined the Cousteau Society when I was in grade school, and I'd had these magazines in my boxes of things from school, and I'd completely forgotten about it.
Oh, wow.
But I actually did not aspire to be a marine biologist. That wasn't my goal, and I actually wanted to be a veterinarian. So it's interesting that I go back and I'm like, oh, hey, I was thinking about this a long time ago. Funny that I ended up here. So as I grew up, I loved animals. I loved nature. I loved science. And I wanted to do something good. That was a value that was instilled in me by my parents. So I just drew a lot of inspiration at that point from nature. But as I got into my career and had different mentors, I definitely started seeing how people carry themselves, how they live their lives, what kind of questions they ask. Did they go with the status quo? Were they afraid or fearless to challenge what we thought about things? And I was always drawn to people that were not afraid to be bold, to go against the grain. I think that's true for me, even with poets. You know, I was always drawn to poets that did things that were sort of against the grain. I'm just very drawn to people that are willing to take a risk and to question things. And so the people that I look to like that in my, even now, I think embody those qualities.
Oh, fantastic. Are there any specific people who are really inspiring you lately?
I can't not mention my absolute favorite scientific mentor, which is Dr. Peter Kariva. He is a great scientist. I worked with him for many years at the Nature Conservancy as our chief scientist and have worked with him since in his later roles. And he's definitely somebody who is a provocateur, and he asks questions and says things that not everybody wants to hear. But I always find that really interesting and brave, really. And so I always challenge myself and try to do that when I get a chance, when I see the opportunity, and to put myself out there and take a risk like that and be willing to let people think I'm wrong or get upset.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned this early interest in nature and animals and that you wanted to be a veterinarian. What maybe turned your eye towards marine science, or when did you start getting interested in this area?
So when I was at the University of Virginia, and I had this very, again, serendipitous experience getting to my major of environmental science. I started with biology, and then I went to government, and then I went to poetry and English. I had all kinds of ideas. In the middle of my third year, I realized, wow, environmental science, I can be outside, I can study nature. I didn't even know we had this major. And I just switched everything and went straight into it. And I was really fortunate to have a professor that was doing work out on the eastern shore of Virginia. So out on the barrier islands that go along the coastline of Virginia. And he put me on this study to look at trees and to look at the age structure of this tree stand of loblolly pines. And I was out there coring loblolly pines, like sticking a core in them, pulling out the insides to figure out how old they were. And I was out there with a bunch of other students, graduate students and undergraduate students. We gotten sort of dumped on this island for the day by a boat, and they all headed over the dunes and went over to the seaside of the island. I was on the backside. And it was like this epiphany moment for me where I thought, wait a minute, I can work at the beach. That was it. I just thought, wait a minute. I love the forest. I love the trees. I'm a big sucker for trees, but can I work next to the ocean or in the ocean? That was everything. And I just switched it all again. And I finished up my degree and went and got my graduate work in marine sciences. For me, that was a moment of choosing fun. When people ask me about my career, I can pinpoint every time I was like, I chose fun. This sounded more fun to me. This sounded like I was going to enjoy whatever it was I was doing more because of maybe the place I was doing it or the people I was doing it with. So that's how I ended up in the Caribbean. Same thing. I had a choice to go to Rhode Island or the Caribbean. And that was just obvious to me.
Rhode Island's lovely, but yeah, I support your choice. Well, Stephanie, that sounds amazing. So are there maybe some key moments then that took you from this point of being a student, kind of realizing you have this passion and you have this opportunity in front of you to pursue this area of science, to now where you are today in a leadership position there at the Nature Conservancy?
One of the things I did after I left graduate school, and I did graduate school in a little bit different way. I did my master's degree and I thought, I don't really want to be an academic. So I finished and I went and decided to explore a bit. I came back later and did my PhD. So after my master's degree, I really wasn't sure. Do I want to go into education? Do I want to go into government work, conservation? I didn't really know anything about conservation. My work was really pure science research. So I started exploring and I tried on a few things. And then I had gone to the Virgin Islands once, just on a very quick trip, and thought it was this incredible place. So I thought, I wonder if I could get like an internship or volunteer or something in the Virgin Islands. So I packed up my bags. I went down there and I started living in St. John. And really quickly, this opportunity came up in St. Croix with the Nature Conservancy. And this is literally 20 years ago in 2001. And they had this internship available to help them develop a country strategy. Like, what are we going to do in the Virgin Islands? And the Virgin Islands is obviously not a country, but that's what they were calling it. So I got this internship and I got sort of thrown into, it was very much baptism by fire. They sort of switched it up on me as soon as I got there and said, oh, wait a minute. Right now, actually, what we need is we've just been asked by the local government to develop a new marine park. And it's going to be the first territorial marine park in the Virgin Islands. And we'd like you to help lead that process.
Oh, wow.
So obviously, I have zero experience doing this. I don't even know much about what a marine park is at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I, of course, said yes. I was excited because I was experimenting. I was like, hey, what is this all about? What is conservation? What do you do? So I had this very defining moment that made me realize this was what I wanted to do. And it's very counterintuitive. So within a month of starting this internship, I was asked to go to a public meeting where they were going to announce that this park was going to be getting developed. And I was just getting to know people. You didn't even know my way around the island yet. And I showed up and I'd had like one meeting with the head of the coastal zone management department there. And so I met them once and I met the director at the door and she said, hi, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming. Don't worry. This is just a basic announcement about what's going to happen. And we're not going to put you on the spot. We just want to introduce you to the community. So I walk in and boy, could she have been more wrong.
Oh, no.
That room was buzzing with grumbles and really angry people. And the whole back of the room was full of really angry fishermen. Because when people talk about marine protected areas, the first thing is fishermen are worried that their livelihoods are going to be impacted, right? So they showed up to this meeting and they were very angry. And so I'm sitting there and I really felt like I had a bullseye on my head. I was wearing my little Nature Conservancy polo with my little logo.
Mm-hmm.
I was like 27 years old. Everybody there thought I was 18. I learned later. So I looked like this little kid. And they started hearing all of the concerns from the fishermen, and the government folks are up there, telling we're going to do this. And this is because of that. And there's this new mandate and we have to meet this goal and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there like, holy crap, what have I gotten myself into? And then the government folks, they're lovely people, but I think they'd had enough of getting beat up on. And so they said, well, we'd love to introduce you to Stephanie Weir, who's going to be leading this process for the Nature Conservancy. And I'm an intern. Mm-hmm. So I'm like not even officially on the payroll at this point. And so I stand up, and after hearing a lot of angry people, I was pretty nervous. And I say, hey, I'm Stephanie. We really are excited about working with the community on this. We want to hear from you guys. We want to hear your opinion. This is about this community. And I tried to make sure I was like, we're going to be inclusive. And I sit down. And this man stands up, and his name was Robert McAuliffe. He went by Mac, and he was this 60-year-old fisherman, wore overalls, baseball cap, big white beard, bloodshot eyes. And he looked at me and he said, you are the devil.
Oh, no.
And he said, the Nature Conservancy is evil, and you get funded by so-and-so, and they have an anti-fishing agenda, and all this stuff that absolutely wasn't true. I mean, I'm not the devil, right? Mm-hmm. And we also didn't get funded by this agency that he was talking about. But anyway, so he said all this stuff, and I'm like shaking in my flip-flops at this point. And it was crazy because I realized at that moment, he said this in front of all these people. So they all now thought these things about me. I walked out of that room and I was hooked, which makes no sense, right? Because that was kind of scary. This man confronted me and I was like, oh, this is what this is about. This isn't about all the nerdy science I just learned. This is about people. This is about figuring out what this community needs and working with these people. And that is when I realized I was signing up for this. And that was it. I did not look back. I knew I was going to be working in conservation, and I was convinced I was going to be working for the Nature Conservancy for a really long time. And here I am 20 years later. But what's funny is Mac, just to tie a little bow in it, became one of my greatest allies and supporters. He's no longer living, and that's its own story. He became a dear friend of mine, but it was because of that work of understanding, and him understanding and me understanding that we needed to work together. And that's what really conservation work is about, is figuring out how you find your common ground and how you respect each other and you listen to each other. And I went up to him at another meeting and said, hey, remember me? I'm the devil. And that was kind of like the beginning of our relationship. That was the point that made me realize my work is about people. And this is really interesting. This isn't just about all the science, which I found interesting in itself. So yeah, that was a long story, but it's really why I'm here now.
Oh, Stephanie, that is phenomenal. And I think this role is so important, this being the bridge between the science and the people who are out there in the community, because I think this is where a lot of the communication breaks down. This is where scientists face a lot of the challenges and failures and struggles. And so I'm so glad to hear that this is a role that you've really been enjoying over the years. And we alluded to some of the exciting work that you're doing on sewage pollution, and I'd love to get into some of the details. So Stephanie, is there a particular project that you have in the works right now that you are maybe the most excited about and want to tell us about?
Yeah. So something, again, that happened not by planning, but by just, I wouldn't say chance, but again, serendipitous. It's the word of the day for me, I guess. This actually takes me back to St. Croix as well. So sewage pollution is what I'm focused on, wastewater pollution now. This is the work that I think eat, sleep, well, try not to eat, but breathe on a daily basis. And this work really came about from years of me working all over the world, because my work took me from the Virgin Islands. Then I started working globally in all sorts of places across the tropics. And everywhere I went, I always noticed sewage pollution, wastewater pollution, flows of raw sewage flowing into these crystal clear blue waters that we're working to protect. And this happened to me every day on my way to work in St. Croix. I drove over a raw sewage flow that went into the very harbor that we were working to protect. And it was this nagging thing. This doesn't seem right. This has got to be problematic. Why don't we pay attention to this? We're talking about overfishing, and we're talking about coastal development. We're talking about all these things, climate. Why aren't we paying attention to this? So fast forward to about maybe 10 years later, and I was the director of coral reef conservation at the Nature Conservancy. And we're really looking at strategy and trying to figure out what else we could do. How do we take it to the next level to improve the future for coral reefs? And one of the things we came up with was we really need to address this wastewater problem. So I went back to get my PhD actually on this, because I felt like very quickly could determine there wasn't a whole lot out there. There wasn't a lot of science that articulated the threat or the impacts, or we weren't seeing a lot of solutions. And I felt like we needed to sort of do a big review and understand where we're at. And so that's where I ended up going back to get my PhD. And it was a great time to focus and sort of recalibrate. So I published all this work looking at the impacts, understanding the distribution, how pervasive, how ignored, and what a big miss that was for conservation, how it was ultimately undermining a lot of the other work we were doing, because it makes very good sense. It's the medium in which these coral reefs or whatever important coastal habitat you're talking about lives within. You want that water to be clean and safe and healthy. And if it's polluted with our waste, it's not going to be. So I sort of have been pecking away at this for the last couple of years, several years now, trying to better understand the landscape, figure out who the partners are, figure out what the solutions are, like really just trying to get interest. And then last year, some magic happened and I held this strategy workshop where I was like, hey, come help me think about, is there a role for us? Is there a role for conservation? Because obviously sanitation is a huge human health issue. And there are lots of people already working in this space. There's this global sanitation crisis. Almost half the world's population doesn't have adequate or safe sanitation. So it's a very big deal. And so there's already a lot of people working on this, but not a lot in the conservation space. So the question was, is there a role? So I got different folks together from different sectors, not even just conservation, all kinds of sectors, to help us think about this. Like, what's our role? What can we do? How can we contribute? We obviously are impacted by this. And we kept talking after that group got together. We kept talking and sharing and getting excited. And last summer, 2020, we decided everybody else was learning how to make sourdough. I did not learn how to make sourdough in 2020, but I did bring together this organization. It just launched in June of 2021. We have a very non-sexy name called the Ocean Sewage Alliance, but we've brought together all these different folks that I was working with, their organizations, and we're growing. We're adding new organizations to the mix so that we can work together focused on this problem. We each bring different aspects of the solution. Some of us bring technology to it. Some of us bring an understanding of the science or the ecological system. Some of us bring the understanding of behavior and human behavior and how you change that, and others about really what the human health implications are or the safety issues for women. It's such an interesting, complicated problem that intersects with social justice and gender equity and everything all in one little toilet, I guess.
Sure.
But we're all looking to each other to figure out how we do this together and understand that the sanitation sector cannot solve this problem by themselves. And if they solve it, they could solve it to the detriment of the environment, right? So we need the environmental sector to be a part of it. We also need to understand all of the social ramifications and whatnot. So we realized there's all this siloed work going on, which is not unusual for human beings. We silo ourselves all the time, and that we wanted to bring it together. So we realized we needed to come together. We needed to work more closely. And so we're starting to do that. And we need to talk about this. People don't know this problem exists. Most people think that if you're fortunate enough to have your own toilet in your own house, you flush the toilet, it's flush it and forget it. They don't think about what happens. They assume it's treated, it's not getting discharged into the environment, or it's not causing any harm. And in many cases, that's not true. So we realized people aren't going to help us solve this problem until they know it exists. So we've launched a new campaign. We're working on getting the word out. We're working on how to, we're figuring out how to work together. We're growing our reach. And it is kind of mind-blowing for me to look back a year later and realize that it exists. And we're getting ready to hire our leadership. It's just totally unplanned and so exciting to see something like that happen coming out of the energy and interest of a wonderful small group of people. What is it that Margaret Mead, don't underestimate the power of just a handful of passionate people. I'm misquoting it, but that's the sort of gist of it. Bringing people together and figuring out how we're going to push forward and get this addressed once and for all. And for people to actually pay attention to something that nobody wants to pay attention to because it's so taboo.
Oh, well, that is phenomenal. Stephanie, it sounds like there was at least a silver lining for 2020, then this project taking root and really blossoming as it went into 2021. You officially formed that Ocean Sewage Alliance. And I love this idea of just breaking down some of these barriers and raising awareness of the issue, because as you alluded to, the general awareness that there is a problem is something that kind of holds you back in conservation sometimes. And I know there are a lot of different challenges that you face and struggles and failures along the path of a scientist. So we love to share those with our listeners in case our listeners are going through them themselves. So Stephanie, when you look back at your own career, are there particular times that you can think of where it just sort of felt like everything was going wrong or that you had a major failure that you had to work through that you can tell us about?
One of the things that I've learned is I forget that they're failures because I always look at them as learning experiences and figuring out how to pivot. Like the way I have always had to work in my work is pivot, pivot, pivot. Okay, this didn't work. Let's try that. It's never like this didn't work. Throw up your hands and walk away. My failures have had to do with maybe me going too hard. So I feel like I've gone through famously now 2 major burnouts. I perceive those as failures. So I'm learning from them and trying to figure out how to cope with that. But it's really hard when you are passionate about something, when something is staring you in the face that needs to be addressed urgently, and you can start easily to feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. It's really easy to just push until you don't have it anymore, right? There's nothing left to give. And that has happened to me twice in my 20-year career. I'm actually sort of coming out of the second time right now. The first time happened right before my PhD. So what do you do when you burn out? Oh, you go get a PhD. That's what I did. And actually that was total luxury compared to the level of work I was doing. So that can give you an idea of just how hard you can push yourself. Conservation is, people feel like it's a calling. It's their passion. It's everything. It's all consuming. And you have to figure out a way to temper that, to dial it back, because you can't do all that great work if you're burnout. And that's what I am learning for the second time and hopefully the last, to steal a phrase from a book that I love called Essentialism by Greg McKeown. You have to protect the asset, you being the asset. And so making sure that you do things in more moderation, perhaps, to make sure that you can continue to do the work that's really important to you. So it's fine to look at things as failures because I'm learning from it that there's so much that you can do as long as you take care of yourself and take a break every now and then, at the very least.
Definitely. And I think these periods of burnout can have a major impact on people, right? Mental health, everything just sort of starts falling apart when you're in one of these periods. So was there a point for you, Stephanie, when you thought about walking away or changing your career or just making a dramatic life change?
Totally. In fact, each burnout, I've had that experience, and I just had this incredible epiphany that I will share with you. The first time, I remember calling a colleague of mine when I was really just worn down and all I was focused on at the time was coral reefs. Now my view is bigger and I'm thinking more oceans and people. But I called this very well respected and somebody I really appreciated scientist who worked in Australia, an Australian scientist who worked on the Great Barrier Reef. And I said, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. I think I need to do something else. This is getting to be really depressing. And he talked me out of it. And I can't even remember at the time what he said, but I remember him talking me out of it and convincing me that I had a lot to contribute and that we needed to just reframe what we want for this system, right? Coral reefs in the future, and how we needed to get comfortable thinking about them being different, that they weren't going to be like they were in the past. They were going to be different, but they were still going to provide important services and value and play an important role in the ecology of the oceans. So that was like that first time. And then the second time was very recently. I was very recently considering like, I don't know if I can do this work and be healthy because I throw myself into it so much that it's to my detriment. So I was filling out this questionnaire and it said, if time or money were not an issue, and you've probably heard this question before, what do you long to do? And I skipped it. It was like a bunch of questions and I skipped that one. I was like, oh God, I have no idea how to answer that question. That scares the hell out of me. So I moved on. I answered everything else. And then I came back and I sat with it and I thought about it. And I thought, I love my family. I'm very happy with my family. I have a wonderful, beautiful family. I love my home. I'm very happy in where I am. So I'm not desiring more of something. Some people will say, oh, I want to travel the world. And I thought, I love to travel. I get to travel for my job. So no, that's good. And I want to do something good for humanity. I want to do something good for people and for nature. These things are very interconnected. And I'm doing that. And I had this moment where I was like, wait a minute. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. I am with exactly who I want to be with. And my only challenge is figuring it out how to do it in balance, to not make me sick, to make me burn out. And it was so powerful because it was really scary when I was thinking, God, I don't think I can do this anymore. And then I realized, no, this is all I want to do. There's no other thing that I want to do. I would still have the same problem no matter what it was. I would push myself. What I have to do, my personal challenge, is figure out how to do it and do it so that it's more in balance, more, as a good friend of mine says, ecological for me, and harmony. So I thought that was really a big deal. I'm floating pretty high on that right now, recognizing I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. I just need to do it differently. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's so helpful for people to hear, because I think many of us have gotten to this point at some point or other in our career, in our life more generally. And I think you do have to kind of teach yourself to put up boundaries, to do things to make what you're doing doable, if that makes sense. Like you said, you recognize that this is something that you were passionate about and wanted to continue. You just had to pave the way and figure out how. So I think that's wonderful.
We're always learning.
That's right. Well, we don't want to dwell on the challenges too long, though, Stephanie. I'd love to talk about some of your successes as well. So do you have a favorite success story you'd like to share?
This is going to be so lame, but it goes back to that story of Mac, of Robert McAuliffe, and the end of that story, I guess. So that was a really hard thing that I had to do in St. Croix. I led a process in the community to develop a marine protected area and to meet the needs of both nature and the people in that community. And it was a really interesting, inclusive process. And I brought all these people together and we developed a lot of trust. And it felt like it wasn't going to happen. The whole time, it just felt like everything's against me. How is this ever going to happen? And in the end, we got it through. And I found myself at a little party, like a cocktail party, celebrating the fact that it had been established, and we did a ribbon cutting, and it was established by law. And this was like the first territorial marine park in the Virgin Islands. And they've been trying to do this for 30 years unsuccessfully. And Mac came up to me and he started taking my elbow and ushering me around and introducing me to all these government officials and saying, this is Steph Weir, and she is the reason why this happened. And I was very uncomfortable with that kind of credit because I knew that this was a group effort. But I also knew that I was a driving force. Like I was the one that kept making people show up and getting things done. But it was just incredible for me to have this moment where Mac was going around proudly introducing me to people and sharing that. And then not too long after that, there was some editorial in the newspaper that was really nasty about the park and threatening towards me. Conspiracy theories and all the crazy ideas people get. And they thought it was some big conspiracy over the work, which there wasn't. But I called Mac and I was crying. I was so upset and I was scared because there was like threats and I was getting threatening letters. And he said, come on over, Steph. And I went over to his house. His wife was there. He gave me a little rum and Coke. You know, it's the islands. Everybody drinks rum. And he sits me down. He pats me on the back. He's like, it's okay. I know who wrote this letter. I'm going to take care of it.
Oh, wow.
He's like, we got this. We know this guy. We're going to take care of it. We're going to explain it. This is going to go away. And he became like this advocate for me. And it went from this person who was so scary at a public meeting saying not nice things about me to being somebody who brought me into his home and helped me when I was struggling and afraid. Because this stuff gets very personal when you're working in communities. And then in the end, the thing that made me realize how much trust we had and friendship we had was I'd moved from the island. My husband got a job. Well, he wasn't my husband at the time, but he got a job. I moved to Florida, took a new job in the Nature Conservancy and left. And a couple of months after I left, Mac's wife called me and she said, hey, Steph, I just want to let you know that Max had a heart attack. He's in the hospital. And I just wanted to let you know. And unfortunately, Mac died a couple of days later. It was that moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I was as important to him as he was to me. And it sounds really cheesy, but it was this moment of like 0 to 100. You go from scary to pure love, somebody that really cared about you to the point that his wife wanted to let me know. I know that that may sound cheesy or whatever, but to me, that was one of my greatest successes because it was so authentic and it was just so true. And it wasn't like a person coming into a community and trying to change things and doing their thing. It was like truly authentic relationships. And I think that that is one of the most powerful things about my work and what I love about my work. It gets me a little choked up because it's why I do what I do. This is about people's lives. I love nature, but this really is about people's lives and living good lives.
Absolutely. Well, Stephanie, this is a beautiful story. This idea, this transformation of this relationship, as you mentioned, from a major adversary to just a staunch supporter and dear friend. And I think that is an amazing success. And I'm sure you've had these sorts of interactions with more people, not just Mac, but this is a particularly meaningful one. And I think this is, as you mentioned, one of the major advantages of the kind of work where you're able to interact with the community and really have big positive impacts on them. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. And throughout our conversation, you've been kind of peppering in inspiration and quotes and things like that from different books. And I'd love to talk with you about books as well. So I'm always encouraging our listeners to read for fun. So Stephanie, do you have a favorite book that you can recommend for our listeners today?
Well, this isn't necessarily for fun, but it will certainly benefit you. And that is the book Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown. I have read this book twice. I've never read a book twice because I loved it the first time and then a few years later needed a reminder. But it's a book that can help you no matter what you're doing in your life because it helps you just get to, and this is of course the essence of what is important to you. What is your greatest contribution you can make to the world, to your life, to your family, whatever that is. And it gives you tools and examples of how to do that. You mentioned, Marie, boundaries. And that is my toughest challenge in life is figuring out boundaries and sticking to them. And this book gives you really great tools. And my favorite bit, and I think he borrowed this from somebody else, but I read it in this book. When someone asks you to do something, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no.
Right.
And I love that advice because it reminds me every time when somebody asks me to do something like, do I feel obligated? Should I? They did something for me. I should probably help, but I'm doing it out of obligation rather than like, hell yes, I want to do this. By the end of the book, I think I was in tears because he just asked you like, how do you want to spend your days? It gets back to that Mary Oliver quote, how you're going to spend this one wild and precious life. It's like, this is it, man. What do you choose? It's a reminder of what choices you're making and how they're impacting you and your family. So that book, I just highly recommend. Really easy, really interesting. Probably going to read it a third time.
Oh, well, excellent recommendation. Stephanie, we will put Essentialism by Greg McKeown on our website for our listeners to find there. And we've talked about just some of the places that you've been for your work. And I think this is a perk of life as a scientist. You get to travel, whether it's for field research, for conferences, to work with colleagues. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I kind of have a tie and they're both kind of similar. So yes, this is one of the great benefits, right? People say, I want to be a marine biologist. And they think all the fun is going to be working with dolphins and whales, which very few marine biologists do. Mm-hmm. But you get to work in the coolest places and work with the most interesting people. And that hands down would be enough for me at this point in my career. So I have two places and they're both very remote and surrounded by water. My first love is Palau, which is a small island nation in Micronesia. 20,000 people live there. And if you look it up, it's Palau, Palau. I think there were some Survivor shows filmed there. I was there once actually when they were filming a Survivor show there. It's just stunning. And it's the kind of place that even if you're not a religious person, you will feel connected to the higher power. Kayaking through the rock islands of Palau is just bliss for me. And when people ask you, like, if you're meditating, you think of a place that's calm and peaceful and whatever. I always think of being there. And then the other place is Palmyra. And Palmyra is an atoll out about 700 miles south of Hawaii. It was actually an old military base in World War II. And the Nature Conservancy owns part of it and the National Fish and Wildlife owns part of it. So it is American territory, but nobody lives there except for people that manage the field station there. Sometimes there's like 4 people there and sometimes there's 10. It's a tiny little place. But I've had the great privilege, and this is truly a privilege as a human on this planet, to get to visit Palmyra because it's very difficult to get to. But it is the home of tens of thousands of birds that live in rookeries there, manta rays that swim up and sort of high five you in the intertidal, baby sharks swimming at the water's edge. It is magnificent. There's just nobody out there. So at night, you can look up and see the full night sky without a single fleck of light pollution. It's just like, You can't be further from people out there, which I love people, but it's pretty magical to be in a place like that.
Well, both of these places sound absolutely gorgeous, Palau and Palmyra. And I'm so happy to hear that your work has taken you to some of these kind of remote places that you might not otherwise have traveled to. And I think as scientists, not only do you get to have these fabulous travel opportunities, but as you mentioned, you work with some phenomenal people, many of whom don't really fit the stereotypes that people, I think, still have of what scientists are like and maybe what science is like more generally. So when you think about all these different groups that you've worked with, maybe the labs that you've been involved with, are there particular quirky traditions that you can think of or just funny or fond memories that you have that kind of show this more human side of science that goes against some of these stereotypes?
In my work, I have rarely come across the stereotypes you see on TV and movies about scientists. What I have found is that scientists are, maybe a little quirky, but no quirkier than anybody else. The ones that I work with in environmental sciences, they're really social, love to meet interesting people. They're great adventurers, often extremely brave, and do things that most people wouldn't dream of trying. And they are collectors of stories. I have so many of these guys in my life, and most of them are guys because it's only recently that more women have been getting into science. But the older guys in my scientific career, they've got the most extraordinary stories and places that they've been and crazy near-death experiences and just really exciting. One thing I will say that is unfortunately true is scientists aren't always the greatest communicators. And this is a challenge that I think is now being acknowledged, even in academia, where they're trying to teach people how to talk about science. I think this has been the challenge people have. And one of the things that continues that stereotype is that they get into the details and they get into the nerdy parts of it and they don't tell you why it's cool or why it's interesting. So we're all trying to do a better job of that in our work. But yeah, I say that about the Nature Conservancy too. You come for the mission and you stay for the people. It's true of my experience in science as well. The cast of characters is long and very colorful.
Phenomenal. So do you guys have any particular traditions or maybe quirky things that you do there at the Nature Conservancy that people might not expect?
I mean, we haven't been together for 2 years. So I'm like trying to remember what it's like to even be around my colleagues. I haven't been on an airplane in 2 years. So I can't think of anything. I wish I could come up with something, but I honestly am just starving to be back with my crew at this point. It feels really good when we're together.
Definitely. And I think so many of us are really looking forward to those in-person meetings, those face-to-face conferences and things like that. So hopefully we'll be back to more normal times soon. And it sounds like you've got a wonderful group there at the Nature Conservancy that you are working with to tackle some really tough questions. So Stephanie, if we took away the barriers that are holding you back, if funding, staff, technology, feasibility, these things were no longer problems, what is the one question or problem that you'd want to address most?
Oh, that's super easy. Taboo. So the problem I'm addressing right now, taboo is keeping us from solving this problem. We could have all the money, we could have all the people and all the science. But if people aren't comfortable talking about the most basic human functions and how to manage them, we can't solve the problem. So my goal is to break taboo and make people a little uncomfortable, maybe get into a space of humor and laugh. But we got to break that down because you can't solve problems that you can't talk about.
Definitely. And I think you're making important progress in this area. So best wishes as you continue to tackle this difficult challenge. And I know a lot of our listeners out there are facing their own difficult challenges every day. So Stephanie, is there one piece of advice that you received that really helped you that you can share with our listeners today?
This is very cliche. My one piece of advice when things are difficult, to go with the flow. And that really fits perfectly with the work I'm doing on sewage pollution right now. So it's what came top of mind for me. But I think that sometimes you just have to go with the flow and you'll figure out how to get over those rapids, I guess, if we're going to stick with that analogy, but or metaphor. But sometimes it's not good to resist and fight, but figure out how to work around.
Definitely. Well, excellent advice for our listeners. Is there any other last message or piece of inspiration that you'd like to end our conversation with today?
The last bit I think I would say is that something to really remember when you hear about, especially nature conservation, because obviously that's the space I work in, is that we are nature. We are not separate. And when we're talking about this work, we're talking about our habitat. And I think it's really important to remember how interconnected everything is and to start looking at the world and paying attention to all those connections because it's a kind of wonderful and wild and beautiful thing.
I love it. A wonderful message to end on here, Stephanie. If our listeners would like to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you do or get connected, what is the best way for them to do so?
So I'm going to do a shameless plug for Ocean Sewage Alliance, since it's what I'm all about right now. And you can go to our website, which is oceansewagealliance.org. We've got all kinds of fun facts and information and ways to get involved, or how you can get involved in your own community. But I think at this point, if you ask me, all I'm going to do is potty talk. So Ocean Sewage Alliance, go team.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website to learn more about the fantastic work that Stephanie is doing in this area. And Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Marie. It's been a great pleasure. I really appreciate the chance.
Well, we've enjoyed chatting with you. Listeners, great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.